So thank you for the introduction. I'm a fourth year medical student, and I'm excited today to talk about personalized learning and learning preferences. And there we go. Okay, so due to the complicated nature of cancer, we tend to give patients a lot of information when they come for visits. And one of the problems with that is patients, like all of us, tend to have issues sometimes with retaining information. So studies have shown that patients can forget anywhere from 40 to 80% of the information that they've been told by the time they get home. And on top of that, what they can remember, they only recall about 50% accurately. And so why is this important? Well, one of the problems with this is if patients aren't able to interpret and understand what they've been told, they go home with gaps in their knowledge. And oftentimes they look to fill these gaps using online resources. And while there aren't inherently problems sometimes with online resources, there are difficulties that come with using them. So these difficulties range from the spectrum of health literacy, but also questions and concerns about quality of resources, and then the relevancy of information and whether it actually pertains to the patients. And looking at this big picture, there have been studies done by Joint Commission and others that have shown that as a patient gets to better understand their diagnosis and their care, it leads to better satisfaction, better compliance, and better outcomes. So knowing that there's such an impact on patient education and their care, this is where we then start talking about learning styles and learning preferences. So both terms get thrown around a lot and oftenly get interchanged for one another, but there are differences between the two. So learning style at its most basic is a way to define one distinct way that a person learns. Whereas a preference, instead of focusing on one way of learning, is focusing more on the choice of one learning situation over another, given a certain point of time or a scenario. And there's also some issues that come with learning styles. So one of them is that learning styles are very inconsistent, and there's over 70 different systems used to establish and categorize them. And on top of this, learning styles sometimes force people into thinking there's only one correct way for them to learn. So as an example, if you tell somebody that they're a visual learner, they may think and they may reinforce the idea that they can only learn through videos and pictures and that the other ways of learning don't matter. And a preference, on the other hand, kind of takes into consideration that there are many different types of learning, but that you pick a preference or a desire based on the scenario or the point in time. And so knowing this, we thought, how can we mold this to medicine and to our patients? So under a grant with Canopy, we partnered with Cancer 101 and their CEO, Sarah Krug. And what she did was she took one of the most popular learning styles tools, the VARK, which stands for visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic learning. And with feedback from over 300 patients, she set out to create a medical version, which they called the Learning Preference Barometer. And so this is just what it looks like on their website. As you can see, they changed reading and writing to linguistic, but other than that, the other three remain the same. And so once we had access to this tool, we then started thinking, how can we personalize information for our patients? So what we did is we looked at non-metastatic, recently diagnosed pancreatic adenocarcinoma patients, and we gave them the Learning Preference Barometer tool. So what this consisted of is an in-person electronic survey done on an iPad at one of their initial visits. The survey was 17 questions with multiple choice answers corresponding to specific learning preference. And then based on the frequency of their responses, they were given a primary learning preference at the end of the survey. And so this is just an example question of what it would look like. So questions range from real world scenarios such as this one to more medically driven questions. But either way, each question had 4 multiple choice answers corresponding to one of the different 4 learning preferences. And the nice thing is at the end, a patient was given feedback in real time. So they would get a graphic such as this that breaks down their learning preferences. And the nice thing about this is they were able to see immediately what their primary learning preference was, but they were also able to talk to the researcher in the room about what these results meant. And then when they left clinic for the day, they were given a piece of paper that gave them access to something called Prescription to Learn, which is where we got into personalized resources. So this was another website through Cancer 101, and it was an opportunity for us to put resources out for patients. So what we did is we looked inside of radiation oncology, as well as reached out to medical oncology and surgical, and we compiled 25 of the most used and highest yield resources within our institute. And we collated those, white labeled them, and put them up on the site for patients to use. And we also categorized them by type of resource as well as learning preference, so patients could filter for either. And then just as an example, this is one of the resources we had used. So this is just a breakdown of multidisciplinary care for pancreatic cancer. And it's a resource that we had labeled as both visual and linguistic. So looking now at results, we had 50 patients total take the survey, and we saw that there was overall predominant for linguistic learning. With that taking about 44% of our patients, followed by visual 34%. And looking at it by gender, we saw that males had a preference for visual learning, whereas females had a preference for linguistic learning. And then breaking it down by age instead. So our average age was 71 with a range from 52 to 88 years old. We saw that the patients in the middle from age 60 to 80 tended to have an equal distribution to what the overall population looked like. But as we got into the extremes on the older and the younger side, we saw not only a preference for visual learning, but higher levels of auditory as well, which we thought was interesting. And it's not sure whether this is significant or just due to the smaller number of patients in each of those age ranges, but nonetheless, something interesting. And then the nice thing with the prescription to learn website that we used is we were able to track patients that clicked on, accessed, and access resources, and then the amount of resources they used. So we saw that about 2/3 of our patients actually did log on to the prescription to learn to access resources, but we didn't see any significant differences in terms of age or gender. But interesting, we did see that 62% of the resources that were utilized by somebody with a corresponding learning preference. So that means that visual patients were seeking out visual resources and so on. However, with that many people actually logging on, not many people sought out a lot of resources. So as you can see, just based off this table here, over 90% only stayed with 1 or 2 resources that they utilized. We had a couple that crept up towards the 6 and the 8, but they were definitely the outliers in terms of everybody else. And then, okay. And then this slide just kind of shows the resources that were actually used by patients. So the ones in green were the ones that were used the most. The ones in yellow were only viewed twice, and then the ones in red were only utilized once. And while it's pretty interesting to see what kind of resources patients gravitated towards, I think the most important thing out of this slide is the relationship between the learning style of the resource or the learning preference of the resource and the learning preference of the patient accessing it. So on the right-handed column in bold are the patients whose learning preference aligned with the resource. And as you can see, for the majority, they do overlap. All right, there we go. All right, so in conclusion, we saw that the majority of our patients did seek out resources through this prescription to learn, but they usually only accessed about 1 or 2. But the access or the resources they did use tend to coincide with their learning preference. So this shows a desire for personalized learning, but also a need to a need for further studies to optimize the personalization and figure out how we can best do patient education. Thank you.